Welcome and thank you so much for coming out tonight. Those of you who were with us for the launch of the Arrival series 2 weeks ago will notice that we're in a different venue. Instead of being in the West Hall of the schoolhouse, we're now in the schoolroom, which is a museum, as I'm sure all of you know. And it is the original free school, the first free school in Toronto. And children from the neighborhood started taking classes in this room in 1848. So as we begin, I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So this is the second program of our Arrival series, where we are hearing from immigrants and refugees, people who have come to Canada to try to start a new life. And the theme for tonight is the Great Escape. So now I'll hand things over to our host, writer, and CBC Radio broadcaster, Michael Enright.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming out today. I don't know, a bit of the history of this. Enoch Turner was a brewer who started this free school. He made beer, a man after my own heart. Good to have you with us. Welcome. Tonight, the Great Escape. The people we're going to be talking to, our guests, have indeed had to flee their home countries. War has a way of turning ordinary people and their families into refugees who are running to stay alive every moment of every day. Just last week, the government of Ireland reported that they had 44,000 refugees from Ukraine, and they were welcoming them to Ireland, and they had no place to put them. Canada has a storied reputation as a haven for those who have risked everything, including their lives, just to get here. With the upheaval of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, thousands fled to Canada. Then the scenario was replayed in August of 1968 when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia. In just 2 years, 1975 and 1976, 60,000 Vietnamese refugees, including many boat people, were taken in by Canada. And of course, there were 44,000 war resistors who came to this country during the Vietnam War, plus thousands who recently fled the civil war in Syria. And we'll talk a bit about that. This is the second in our series, and we want to talk to our guests about their lives before they fled, and their lives now since coming to this country. After a conversation with our guests, we'll open the floor to questions, and we also have people listening and watching online, and we will have questions from them as well. So I just want to welcome our three guests, and I wonder if we could start them off by each of you give us your name, where you came from, and when you came to Canada. Start with me.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone. My name is Mir Madavi. I am from Afghanistan. I came to Canada in 2003. And is that enough?
That's fine. Ines?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ines. I came to Canada in 2018, about 4 years ago, and I came from Syria.
My name is Javed. I'm originally from Burma, left Burma in 2013, but washed up in Canadian airport in 2017, Christmas.
And you want us to use the name Burma instead of Myanmar?
I'm equally good. I just prefer to use the one that reflects the reality.
I'd like to get a sense from each of you what conditions were like in your country that made you decide to get out to leave. Mir, let me start with you. Afghanistan?
Well,
You're a journalist, right?
yes. In 2002, American troops entered Afghanistan, and the Taliban regime was collapsed magically in one night. Everything changed in one night, and we had a democracy, and we had a government made of democratic values and things like that. So I established my own way of distributing democracy, which is newspaper. So I founded a newspaper. I was the founder and the editor-in-chief of a weekly newspaper. And in 1 year, I was working towards a society free of religious influences, a secular society. In about a year, I was accused of attacking Islam, or Islamists tried to blame that I inflamed religious war. I was in jail for 7 days and sentenced to death. And a huge international pressure came onto Afghan government to release me. I was released with the help of a huge coordination of international organizations like PEN Canada, PEN International, Human Rights Watch, and different organizations. And I was brought to Pakistan. And after 2 months, under an emergency case, I brought to Canada.
You were accused of promulgating blasphemy.
Blasphemy, yes.
How is that defined anyway? For those of us who
it is definable.
Years ago.
It is definable if you want to. Every religious community had their ways of defining things. So they were saying Islam is the only way of life in Islamic society, and Islamic government is the only government we want. If someone stands against the way of our life or against our way of governing society, is someone who stands against the God.
You were writing about corruption in the government as well.
I was, yeah.
Now, this was in a time when the Canadian government was honoring Hamid Karzai,
yes,
in Ottawa. How did that make you feel?
Very, very difficult to understand, because Hamid Karzai himself was one of the most corrupted person in Afghanistan. He wasted not only our financial sources, but also the opportunity that we could establish a free society, a society made of democratic values. But unfortunately, no one paid attention to that time.
Yeah. And us, Syria, we know it as a civil war, a bloody civil war. What was it like for you before you decided to move?
Actually, it wasn't a civil war. At the beginning, it was a very peaceful uprising. People just went into the streets. They were protesting, asking for freedom, asking for democracy, going against corruption, basically. But
things that we take for granted.
Yes.
Right.
The regime there, the Syrian regime, responded very violently towards those peaceful protests, and the situation escalated very quickly due to multiple reasons, one of which is the interventions of many different international countries in the peaceful uprising, including extremists and many other countries like Iran, Russia, Lebanon, the US, lots of countries. So my personal story is that I was a normal student there. I was in high school when it started. And me and my family, we participated in the peaceful protests, and we stayed there. I personally stayed there until 2015, until it became very risky. One of my friends got arrested under torture. He gave a name, one of which was my name. So it was impossible for me to come back to the country.
You knew your life was in danger?
Yes.
So you had to get out.
Yes, I left Syria and I went to the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and a mutual of friends between both of us, because I wasn't able to contact that person, my friend who was in jail. he delivered a message. It was like, do not come back, you are in the wanted list. And that was the end of it.
Was it inevitable that you would have been arrested, thrown into prison, and tortured?
Yes.
What about your family? How did they feel about all this? Because they were politically active too, right?
Yes. We were like sort of like divided. Some of us were still in the country for reasons like myself. I had to be there because I was simply giving in my high school exams. Other parts of my family, other members of my family were outside because it was very risky for their lives, because there were like warplanes attacks, chemical weapons attacks, pearls, there were explosions happening everywhere. So my family decided that whoever has to stay in the country for legit reasons to them should stay. That was me.
Yeah.
And it was me, my mother, and a younger sibling. Other parts of the family were outside Syria.
All right, we'll get back to your story later. Javed, tell me about your situation as Rohingya in Myanmar, Burma. What was it like before you left?
Before I left, I was born right about a decade and a half before what today becomes known as the Rohingya genocide, which escalated in 2013, but came to a point of full-blown genocide in 2017. But since I was born and growing up, there was this gradually stripping of rights bit by bit of the various minority, but the Rohingyas were at the end of the spectrum where like they suffered the most. So growing up since about 2000s to all the way 2013, it wasn't necessarily open and free, but it was somehow livable. So, and then the rights that were being a strip up from my parents all the way to me were, it was so gradual that nobody took notice.
What kind of rights? What were stripped away so slowly that people didn't notice?
It began with freedom of the right to movement, to access to healthcare. For example, in my grandparents' time, if you are Rohingya or you belong to this minority, you would be able to travel as long as it is inside the country. And then in my parents' time, it became, okay, if you're a Rohingya, you will be able to travel anywhere as long as it is within the state. And when I was born, it's like you would be able to travel anywhere as long as it is the town you were born in. And by the time I was leaving, it became to this specific village, which we call like a 3-kilometer radius universe, because I won't be able to, I wasn't allowed to leave that specific village, which has like, you can trespass within 30 minutes or so.
What if you had stayed? What would have happened to you and your family if you had stayed?
I think it was, staying was possible. If staying was possible, I don't think anybody would have fled. And then those who decided to stay until the very last moment, and there was like well-documented examples of they were shooting from the back as people were fleeing.
Shooting them in the back.
Shooting them in the back as they were fleeing through the Naf River to the other side of the border.
I want to talk to each of you about how you got here. What were the mechanics of getting here? But Javed, you've written a book called Escape from Manus Prison. I haven't finished it, but it is shocking, to say the least. There's one part of the book where you're talking about being in a boat with other refugees, and the water comes up to your ankles, then to your knees, then to your... to me, you're lucky to be alive. But tell me about this prison, this Manus.
Right, this Manus prison was a secret detention set up by the Australian government in South Pacific on an island called Manus, which was a naval base, the Australian naval base, and there's a small high security prisons that were built for people who seek asylum in Australia. So as soon as you would you arrive at the Australian shores and claim asylums, and you were briefly sent there and then forgotten about. And the prison was designed in a way where you were cut out pretty much from the rest of the civilization. It is so remote that you have nothing surrounding about 200 and 300 kilometer radius, but water. So like you can't escape, you can't do anything. You were like not able to communicate with the outside world, and it's like once there, you are kind of like forgotten. So I was able to leave because I decided to take things on my own hand.
Yeah.
But my friends have spent a decade, and some of them are still in the system.
The Australians call it a transit center.
They named it from offshore detention center to processing center to transit center to whatever word they could sugarcoat and then like deceive the public, or any word that they could legally allow to squeeze in. But the reality is,
near Manus Island, the largest town is called Lorengau.
right.
And you say in the book, I just want to read this, that Lorengau is a humble community of 6,000 people, and we lived in fear of every one of them. Why?
So the way the mechanism that was used to detain those refugees on that island was kind of a divide and conquer. For those of us who were put inside the prison, we were told the outside community is like so much far behind. They somehow still practice cannibalism. And to those in the community, we're told these refugees inside were so dangerous and so bad that we couldn't keep them in Australia. That's why we have to ship them here and put in the high security prison. So it was feeding once again each other. As much as we live in fear, every one of them, they were also made to fear us, those of us inside the prison.
How did you each get out? Because a lot of people suffer at the hands of human traffickers, people, agents who charge an enormous amount of money to put you into a leaky boat, and I'm just curious how you went about getting out. Mir, how did you get out of Afghanistan?
For me, that wasn't a difficult part of my journey, because all I had to do is to get myself into Pakistan.
And once there, you could go anywhere.
Yes. So I was told with organizations who were working for my freedom, they advised me that they actually arranged a trafficker who take me from near the border of Afghanistan and take me right to Islamabad, to the capital.
Did you have to pay for this?
They did it. I didn't pay anything.
You didn't.
They paid, yeah. So he took me. When we reached the border, we had to walk. So we walked about 2 hours or almost 3 hours, and then we reached in a small village, and then they rented a taxi cab and took us into Pakistan, and from there we went to Islamabad. So my journey in that part wasn't very dangerous.
Why did you pick Canada? Why did you choose this country?
I was offered the entry to the United States, England, and then Canada. I chose Canada, and I'm very happy these days I've made that choice. Canada was not involved in war. Canada was a very welcoming country. And I was always remember this, that in my first days in Canada, I felt very welcoming, and I felt a sense of belonging to this community, although I wasn't speak the language properly in that time.
I take what you're saying, but can you explain to me why it's so difficult to get some of your countrymen out of Afghanistan? The interpreters who worked for us, the people who worked in the embassy, so on, can't seem to get them out. What is the problem?
That's difficult question to ask, I guess, because the bureaucracy around the government issues. I don't think there's any specific organization is responsible for doing this. Nobody knows who's responsible for those people to take care of their visas and the process of getting them into Canada. I don't think there is a specific office to be assigned for this. I guess that's the main issue. Otherwise, Canadian government was always very open, very helpful, very welcoming.
And now, how did you get out?
Just to connect to what
Jimmy.
sorry,
Javed.
I was saying a while ago, I wanted to jump in, but I felt like I'll just wait until my room.
Jump in.
He was talking about present and detached ones, and I think this is an overarching theme of most of the dictatorship governments, because it is exactly happening in Syria as well. My grandfather went against the government in the 80s, against the father of the president, who's like in office right now, and he was arrested, and he's still arrested till this very day, and we have nothing, like we know nothing about him, and they do not say if he's alive or dead. And he was imprisoned in one of those detached prisons, except that prison is in the middle of the desert instead of an island. So I just wanted to comment on that. With regard to my story, I left Syria in 2015 and I went to the UAE. My father used to work there. We had temporary visa under sponsorship of a local citizen. Well, the country there claimed that we are refugees. We were technically not refugees because we were under paid temporary visa. Then by chance, I used to volunteer in one of the organizations that was authorized here in Canada, a nonprofit organization. It was an organization that bridged Syrians with other Syrians around the globe to find solutions for their problems. Say, for instance, I am a doctor who lives in the UK, and there is a Syrian individual who's in the UK and seeking help from a physician. We connect them together. So through that organization, one of my friends who works in that organization actually lives in Canada 20 years ago. He introduced me to one of the grassroots community private sponsorship groups here in Toronto. That's RRR. They sponsored my family through private sponsorship, through church sponsorship. I applied in 2016 for me and my family, and we came to Canada in 2018.
There are a lot of community organizations, particularly a lot of churches, sponsored Syrian families. Did the people in Syria know about this? Did you? No.
Not really, no.
No.
That's why most of them, first of all, Canada is quite far from Syria and the Middle East. Most of the Syrian refugees who are still in Syria or in the nearby countries, they're seeking the more risky way to go to Europe, that is through the boats. And unfortunately, it's a death trip or a death journey that majority of them are dying in the way to go there. And aside from that, also the paperwork is huge to come to Canada, and you need to have someone here.
Have you kept in touch with people in Syria beyond your family? What is the opposition now? How is it now?
Like, you mean the political situation there right now?
Yeah.
There is, well, I come from a city that is located in the northern side of Syria, and this city is out of the government control. So there are like a city and sort of like a countryside of another city, that is Aleppo city, that are outside the government control. The rest of Syria is basically under the government control, but you can say it's under the Russian control. That's the situation there. The opposition just went down, and the majority are, unfortunately, Islamic extremists in those liberated areas. Not that what we hoped actually when we started the uprising.
Javed, the people that you left behind, whether friends or relatives or whoever, colleagues, do they want to get out the way you did, or how are they living their lives in Burma now?
Right. Some of them are, but some of them are not. And it's not like if you want to leave, you can just leave. As
You can't
happen.
No.
It's like people, for example, for us, it was a collective decision. Whoever can move should get out. And there were like peoples with physical and other sort of like health and other attachment to, and some just simply decided, for example, like people of my grandparents' generations, like I just want to die where my husband died, and I just want to die in my garden. Like, so there's like attachment issues. There was people who are not strong enough to move, and oftentimes it is not just a Uber ride or just a bus. Like, you have to take some pretty dangerous journey to be able to cross the river to make it to the other side. And yet there was no guarantee that how and when you'll be able to get access to like things like in refugee camps, and refugee camps are not among the most welcoming places on earth, and they were a challenge of their own.
What I'm trying to imagine being in a situation where you have to get out or you die or wind up in prison. What were your first days like in Canada? And that's what was it like for you?
When I arrived here was October the 3rd, 2003, and we were brought into Hamilton. Hamilton was full of snow, very, very cold. I didn't speak the language. I didn't know the city. I didn't know anything about their culture. Very, very difficult. Almost after 20 years, when I passed by the area that I lived for only a couple of days, I still feel the pain that I went through those days.
How did you live? How did you make a living? How did you provide for you?
No, we were supported by the Canadian government, so we were taken into a hotel, and then they provided us an apartment. The transition was very smooth. They helped us financially, no problem, but emotionally, it was very difficult. The shocking moment of transferring yourself from one culture into another culture, from one local community into another local community. This transition was very, very painful and difficult because the language was not involved. We communicate through language. We understand each other by using language. But unfortunately, because of our difficulty to speak the language, we weren't able to use the language. So we have to communicate different ways with the people that we were communicating. So it was very, very challenging time.
In us, Mir talks about the psychological shock and the emotional pain of arrival. What was it like for you?
It's hard to answer this question, to be honest, because until this very day, I'm just like quite confused about how I feel. But I remember my first couple of days, I remember actually going out of the airport and just breathing the air. And it's like, it's something different. It's different than what it was in Syria, and it's different than what it was in the UAE. And I remember there was like a police officer, not a security guard in the airport, who was like, welcome to Canada. And I felt welcomed. I really felt welcomed. But there was this still small part that still attached to what's going on in Syria. So we were like, yes, we are in Canada, but we're sort of like following up on what is going on in Syria. We still have friends and family and relatives there. And here comes the survival syndrome, I think, where you feel why I was the one to survive, not them. And here comes the conflict.
What was the hardest thing in those early days and months?
I think feeling that I deserve to be safe, pretty much, not them, the people who are still there. That was the hardest part. Thinking of friends who were like, some of them are like at the very first days contacting me to know how did I come to Canada and what is the way, and trying to explain it to them, providing resources as much as possible, but still feeling that, is it me, the person who's deserved to be saved, or them? Or would if I was there, would have done better job being on the ground in Syria or being outside? What's the best?
I find that fascinating that there was an element of survivor guilt.
Yeah.
All three are nodding. Why am I able to make it and the others can't?
Yeah.
Do you still feel that way?
I think it is very, very real. For example, for me, I feel like a coward, like for leaving all my friends, like 1,000 plus.
You felt like a coward.
Who were like imprisoned there for 4 years at that time when I was leaving. But yet, because I have to escape secretly, I couldn't even tell them goodbye. I couldn't even tell them, like, both for their safety and for my safety. And by the time I was able, I was finally to get on the plane and then plane off the island. And I looking down from the plane with the whole prisons. I felt like a coward, that's like leaving them behind in the unknown and knowing, I don't know what my future holds at the time, but I know what's gonna be the next day for them, just waking up in the same prison, going through the same routine. And yet I didn't tell them I was going. I felt like a coward. And I'm like, I think everybody there deserved as much of an escape as I did. And that guilt is really hard to overcome.
A lot of people who survived the Shoah, the Holocaust, feel the same way. They feel uncomfortable about their freedom in a way. What did I do to deserve this? And not my father or sister or grandfather.
Yeah, it's really hard to overcome that part, especially if you know that like they're destined to spend, which turned out to be a decade of more imprisonments in there. In my cases, like it just felt like there are definitely friends who deserve, if not as much as me, like more than me, like deserve the same equal opportunity, and not to be stuck on a remote tropical prison.
How did how did Canadians respond to you showing up? What was our reaction? And us first?
I think I wouldn't blame Canadians. It's hard to conceive. And I think, I'm not sure if you guys feel the same, but it's hard to share those feelings, especially at the very first, I would say, couple of years for us here. I think, well, Canadians, like my sponsors, they were extremely supportive, helping us integrate into the community by finding wherever we were seeking to, schools or work. I think that was the first step that was comforting for me personally. But through that feeling of guilt the feeling of guilt is actually feeding the feeling of responsibility, which actually kept us moving in Canada, kept us doing what we wanted to do, because it goes back to like, I want to do something for those people I left behind. So through that process is where actually Canadians, my sponsors, contributed to my journey, helping me navigate my options here pretty much.
Mira, what about you? How do you think we responded?
I was telling us in the waiting room that I spent most of my life in immigration and refugees condition. I was 6 years old when the war started up in Afghanistan, and I went to Iran with my family, and I lived in Iran and lived in Pakistan, lived in different countries, always as a refugee, always as the other, as the second person, as the one who has no document, no visa, no status of social status. When I came to Canada, I felt absolutely different. Like I felt very welcoming sense of feeling among the society. I wasn't feeling that I am viewed as the other, as someone who has no identity, as someone who is not allowed to be in this society. And that was absolutely for the first time in my life to have this sense of feeling that I actually belong to some part of this world.
So you felt that for the first time, or at least this time,
in my life,
you have a country.
Yes, absolutely. And that feeling still exists in me. I feel Canada is one of the warmest country when it comes to immigration. The most welcoming country. I traveled in different parts of the world.
Even with all of the financial problems, the economic problems,
everything,
the settlement problem, getting someplace to live.
It is important to take care of financial needs, but I think it's more important to take care of their psychological needs, their emotional needs. If refugee feels that they are safe and welcomed, they can survive with lesser help, lesser financial help. And that's what happened in Canada. And I think that is very, very good thing about Canadian.
Javed, what about you?
Mine was quite different, actually. The time I arrived, first of all, I didn't know the weather could get so cold. That was like, I didn't know that I will be coming to Canada 24 hours before that. And this is the only one-way ticket that I could afford at the time and allow me to go. So I just picked it up and then like I kind of, that's why I always use, I washed up at the Toronto Pearson Airport instead of I arrived. Because I didn't know, it was just random on Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
I arrived and then
You arrived on Christmas Eve.
yeah, correct.
Oh,
And then I was quite emotionally and physically prepared to go through the same treatment that I went in Australia, but that wasn't the case in Canada. So that was good. But
how did the officials treat you, the security people and the?
so one specific example that is also in the book was like I arrived at the detention center because I wasn't, at that point, I have crossed 6 countries and 3 continents without a single passport on my name. So the passport that I was allowed to get on the plane was not genuine, but I was able to travel with it. And then like by the time I get to the immigrations at the airport, I was mentally and physically prepared to send to detention. So that was the case that I went through in Australia, where like a straight to the detention. But then the immigration officer at the airport was, and at that point I was quite unwell because I hadn't eaten for 3 days because I was on the run, and then like I was like quite in pain from my stomach. So like I wasn't quite able to stand straight because the pain in the stomach was like bending me over and over. And then when I went to the immigration officers, I was just straight. This is not the document that I'm genuine. And then like yada yada, and then like the guy, the immigration officers put me in a room, in the interview rooms, and then left. And then I was expecting for him to come with to come with more police, and then like to put me in the prison because I wasn't traveling with proper documentation and whatnot. And then he arrived with a sandwich and a Coke. And then like he said, the kitchen closed, it is past midnight. The kitchen closed, I have nothing, but I'm also not gonna interview someone who is in pain from hunger. So like, here, please eat, then we can carry on. And then like, so it was kind of shock for me at the time. First of all, for me, any uniform is default military and brutality there. That's what my life has been in Burma. And the last 4 years in prison kind of reinforced that. It's not just green military uniform. Any uniform that the prison guard would change over and over was like an indicator that there is a torture coming. And then like when I was hand down by a uniform sandwich, and I was like, is this real? Like, is this actually happening? So it was like quite a shock for me at the time.
I wonder how many other refugees or immigrants generally feel the same way, that the sight of a uniform reminds them of oppression rather than protection or service or whatever. What do you think?
I think in the case of refugees, that is very, very true. Right? Generally speaking, police officers or the law enforcement who wants to take you in custody, to pressure you, to try to identify you, who are you, and where are you coming from. And that is the general picture that all immigrants has.
I totally agree. I was avoiding police at my very first year. And I remember I wanted to do a voluntary job, so I have to get something from the police.
That's right.
Tender. Yeah, and I was outside, and I was like, do I go in? Do I go out? No, do I stay out? And then there was this police officer looking at me from the outside. And he was like, do you need something? I was like, yeah, I just need to drop this paper. And it was, I would say I was afraid of him. He was too nice to me. And then throughout time, like as the year passing, and I went into a discipline that involves police, I got rid from this fear, of that fear, yeah.
Can I add one thing?
Please.
I worked in Hamilton Spectator as an internship for 1 year. So I was writing short website reports every morning.
Right.
And there was another internationally trained journalist working with me at the same time. And so calling to police was one of the difficult things that we had to do every day. And then one day we had an invitation from Hamilton Police Chief. He invited both of us into a Middle Eastern restaurant, and he came there, and sat with us and said, "Don't be afraid of us. We're very happen. Yes, in Hamilton. We are very good people. We're here to protect you. I heard that you guys are not very easygoing when it comes to policing. So he himself, after that, he took us for a tour in different departments of Hamilton Police, and that was a very good introduction to Hamilton, to Canadian police.
Every summer in August, we have an air show in Toronto, jets flying over the city. And I knew someone who lived in Sarajevo during the war, and the jets reminded her of that and made her very uncomfortable. And I guess there are things here that remind you of where you're from. And
yeah, I'm still I was still rewiring my brain whenever I hear a siren. Like there's not a police car chasing me, but it's like a fire truck running to help somebody. And the same thing with the initially during my first 2 years, I struggled quite a lot with the radio chat because that was one of the signatures of prison guard coming and passing by. So it doesn't matter whether it's a traffic police or it is any security. As soon as I hear radio chatter, like I start having this panic attack. Like it's like a almost automatic, involuntary reaction to that of trigger experience.
what about getting work, getting paid to do stuff? I mean, Mir, you had to drive a cab, right?
Yes, for years, yeah.
We hear stories about engineers and doctors and people from other countries having to drive taxis or work in cleaning office buildings. So what was that like for you?
Very, very challenging. I had to feed my family, Michael, and it didn't take no time to choose to find a job to feed my family. So taxi was available, and I drove taxi for a long time in Hamilton. I worked in many different, not many, but several different places. I worked for George Brown College as a writer in residence. I worked for Hamilton Spectator. I worked as a researcher, but mostly I worked as a taxi driver, as a truck driver, as a tow truck driver. I still couldn't find a chance to settle myself in an employment, good place, but trying my best to find it.
And that's what about you? You were a student in Syria.
Yeah.
And you wanted to be a student here, I think.
Yes, but I worked for like almost 2 years in sales in here. I worked as a sales representative in FIDO, telecommunication. And right now I'm working at U of T. I'm working as a research assistant.
And if I'm right, you're studying forensic anthropology.
Yes, right now I'm in my 4th year. I'm specializing in forensic anthropology and minoring in mathematics.
Ooh. Speaking as a high school dropout, one of your missions in life, or something you want to take on, is that you want to identify mass graves, or tell me about that. It's extraordinary.
Back home, I used to do engineering, actually, electronic and communication engineering. And I moved between campuses. Each campus I was in got bombed several times. So I eventually, when I came to Canada, I had those wide ranges of options. And I knew I wanted to do forensic science. I wanted to do something that would give me a formal status to go back to Syria, because I can't go back to Syria at all as the regime is there. But I always had this idea in my head that, well, at some point, the war criminals will take a stand in the international courts, and I want to be part of the solution. So that's why I went into the forensic science program.
It sounds like an extraordinarily difficult mission.
It is, considering that it's a totally different language for me. Back home, I used to study in Arabic. It's an entire different language, whole different country, and I have a purpose, and I'm trying to focus on it. So the plan is, when the time comes and those massive graves, there are hundreds of them, get reopened and go into investigations. First of all, the remains will go back to their families for their loved ones to bury them, and the war criminals will take a stance, and hopefully justice will take place.
Do any of you have any hope that things are going to get better? In Afghanistan, the Taliban are in charge. Syria, dictator, bloodthirsty dictator. The Rohingya are still being persecuted in Burma. Do you have any hope that things will change for the better? Do you have that?
Not fast enough, like not soon enough that like people living on the ground don't have the luxury of waiting, for example, the International Criminal Court to go through, which take decades, if not like years. They just simply don't have the luxury of like time, and I think things will get worse, especially in the case of Burma, before if it will ever get to a little bit livable condition, survivable condition.
What about Afghanistan? Because there was a lot of talk here that, pardon me. Well, these Taliban are not like the old Taliban. The Taliban now are more progressive. They're more, pardon me, intellectually capable. They're not quite as, they're more secular. Is any of that true?
No. It's not. Taliban is the Taliban, and they say that very clearly. They haven't changed at all. They try to hide their true face when they capture the whole country. But I have a hope for the future of Afghanistan, and I think Afghanistan will rise up, and we will get back our country sooner or late, because this darkness is not natural. It's not something that it can resist change that is naturally coming. Freedom, education, equality between man and woman, those things are naturally bound with human. So as long as we're human, we are seeking justice and freedoms and education and equality. And these shadows are, it will be shadows.
I have the same feeling totally. There's a Palestinian poet who said, on this earth, there is what is worthy to live. And to me, it is hope. And for the Syrian situation is that there are actually international movements or like going towards finding a solution. And that solution does not include the Syrian regime in the picture anymore, because the regime is like accused of committing war crimes, sorry. And there are lots of international courts that are happening in Germany and in other countries in Europe where war criminals are taking a stance, and 2 of them are in prisons in Germany. Right. So I think there is hope.
Have any of you or all of you been subjected to, or have you had to confront the idea of racism in this country? And the reason I ask is, when I was growing up in Toronto, not far from here actually, you would have been called DPs, displaced person. And there was an element of racism in that, because you're not like us, you're different, and you're strange. Have you found any of that in your?
Yeah, I did actually quite a few times, but it is very subtle, very sugar-coated, and you won't notice it unless you pay specific attention. For example, and this was one of the points that earlier, I think one of my colleagues was making, like the employments, like sometimes there are like well-intentional measures put in place for the procedural need of that position, but oftentimes people who were fleeing wars and people fleeing persecutions were measured by the same ruler as you would measure of a privileged person who never have to go through anything through that. And if you are measuring how fast somebody can swim between a fish and a monkey, obviously the fish gonna outswim the monkey, but I think that's often the case. Specific to racism, the way I said it is subtle. It's like sometimes, one specific example was like I was at school and then the person didn't know my background or anything. And then after the end of the conversation, the prof like, I was a refugee at one point. Oh, you speak really English for being a refugee, and then like that. Those kind of encounters always happen. And it is very subtle unless you pay, or unless you happen to be unlucky as me, who pay attention to like observe like things that are very obscure. That happen a lot.
Did you find any of that?
I had the same situation, especially in school. It's it's something like, I would call it a polite racism. It's not that obvious unless you pay attention to it. There is this sort of discrimination happening, and I think it's happening on different levels. It's not just racism, it's sexism, and it's misogyny happening a lot. And it's affecting, I believe, most of the communities, most of the societies around the globe, not just the Canadian one. But I have this sense of becoming a Canadian citizen soon. I work towards eradicating these. So that's why I got myself into the EDI committee in the school, where we try to include more diversity in our program, in the school staff in general and stuff like that. But I think, it exists.
You are white. Javed is of tawny hue, let's say that. Did you find any sense of racism? Or?
Obviously, yeah, for sure.
How was it expressed? How was it manifest?
I want to say that the Canadian system was always supportive of inclusive society. So that was very, very important to me. Individual approaches to inclines towards racism was unavoidable. I'm giving you one example. So I'm driving taxi in Hamilton, and I had a customer, a very white person, and he said, "Where are you from?" I said, "From Afghanistan." And he said, "Well, you live a good life here." I said, "I think so." And he said, "But our son and daughter are getting killed in your country to bring democracy for you, but you live a privileged life here." And I said, "Did I ask you to send your daughter and your son to my country? Did I?" He said, "No, but we sent to bring democracy to your country." I said, "Did I ask you to bring democracy to my country?" So I tried to be very polite, and the gentleman understood that he was on the wrong side. So I had different experiences, but to me, it's always individual expression of a kind of competition between things and between getting a job and stuff like that. But the system is always support.
I want to jump on here with a specific example to add on what you just said. I feel like I have a specific example with the first landlord in Canada, where I was renting a room. And then I think sometimes it is lack of exposures, and then not being able to see or to meet a single person of the other side. All the information we have got to that point is through mass media or through other media. Yeah. So my landlord was saying, he was pretty grumpy at me with me at the same from the beginning. And then at one point he was saying, after we got along quite a bit, after a while, we became pal. And then he was, "Oh, you're the nicest Muslims I've ever seen." I said, "Okay, but I'm not anymore." "Well, then you're the nicest brown man I've ever seen." So sometimes I feel it is a lack of exposures and not meeting the other side, a single person, never having a conversation, but everything that's being feeded through media and other filters.
Let me might end on this. I'm keen to know, would you ever go back?
Yeah,
if the
situation is perfect, 100%.
You would go back to Afghanistan, you go back to Syria?
Yeah. I don't think I've ever met any person, a single person who likes to abandon their homes and everything they have known to that point. I've yet to meet a single person who say I love to abandon my country and come to a place.
That's why throughout history, it's always being detached from your country was the harshest punishment, even harsher than beheading.
Yeah, but can I add a comment here?
Please.
I feel like we are growing into two different worlds and two different cultural sets. So I am a Afghan Canadian, who loves Afghani food, who loves Afghan poetry, Afghan music, also loves Canadian, hockey, who loves going to the beautiful environment in Ontario, who loves, to enjoy his life in Canada. So as I grow up in this environment, my back home becomes more of a mental image that I have. And the Canadian society become more practical things that I gain through it. If I go back, I'm 100% not the same person that left Afghanistan. I am a Canadian Afghan who goes back to this country. Considering this, I always love to go back. And when I graduated from my PhD at Trent, I was about to go back to Afghanistan to teach. I had 2 offers from 2 different universities in Afghanistan to teach. And it didn't have enough time, and the Taliban took control of the country, so I had no chance to go back. Otherwise, I would.
But none of you has gotten rid of the hyphen, right? Afghanistan, Afghan Canadian, Syrian Canadian.
I think nobody will ever be able to. We oftentimes, when we hear a story again, let me put the media here, like from the media, like the story often starts at the Canadian border, at the arrival of Canada, but the person doesn't start leaving as soon as they arrive in Canada. They have a whole life prior to arriving at Canada. And I don't think you can just magically erase that part and like become detached from that part. Like it's ingrained in you, sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously. And I think that would be hard, the hardest part to, if you try to detach them like from that person, I think that's very unlikely.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here with us. That was Javed Ilam, Mir Hussein Madavi, Inas Abu Laziz. I'm sorry, I fucked up your names. We have questions from people who've been listening and watching online, and I just like to throw them out. Anyone wants to jump in? Some of them are directed to you, some of them are just general. So is that okay?
Sure.
All right. Here's first question. This is from someone online. If you could speak directly to the people you had to leave behind, what would you say to them now?
Sorry.
If you could speak directly.
Sorry them.
To the
sorry for leaving them behind, and sorry.
Sorry for leaving them?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. The same. I'm sorry for leaving you behind.
Sorry, and so.
Really? That's the uppermost in your mind.
That's something that haunts you in the end of the night.
But it would
stop you from sleeping.
It would be an apology. You make an apology.
Yeah. You feel like you betrayed them.
All right, next question. What are the greatest misunderstandings or biases Canadians hold about your home country?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
What are the greatest misunderstandings or biases that Canadians hold about your home country? Yeah? What do we think of Afghanistan?
I don't think that there is a clear picture of Afghanistan for Canadians because what is repeating every day makes the picture of what we can see from Afghanistan. This is the main issue. I was always thinking how to introduce Afghanistan's poetry and culture and art and music to Canadians to see how wonderful we are when it comes to poetry. I'm not talking about Rumi. Rumi is from Afghanistan. I'm talking about the contemporary poetry of Afghanistan and art. This is something that needs to be done. There's a absolutely misunderstanding and misnaming and misfaming of Afghans and their culture and their behavior.
Yes, what's our big misunderstanding about Syria?
I think basically that most people think that it's a civil war.
I made that mistake at the very beginning.
Okay, I always corrected people. It's not civil war. It's peaceful demonstration that was taken to get escalated to become a civil war. But it's people asking for democracy, people protesting for their rights to be free, for the rights to speak. Those are, like I mentioned at the beginning, those are things, luxury that people actually have here and they're not aware of. I think this is the biggest misunderstanding for me now that I continuously face. Yeah.
Javid?
I think hardly any Canadians are aware of Burma. I often have to locate them, like where it is. It is between China and India. So I don't think there is a very misunderstanding. Oftentimes it is misinformed stuff like, oh, it's a peaceful British country as soon as like they imagine this monk sitting, but I think the reality is quite different on the ground. And I think a lot of Canadians are not actually aware of like different kind of Buddhism that being practiced. And I think that's more of a misinformed or not well informed.
Next question. Again, this is from people watching online, and then we'll go to our audience here. What do you want people to know about the role that total strangers played in the story of your arrival?
I don't think I'll be here sitting if it wasn't the kindness of the strangers in my case. At every single point, I had the help from people who were employed in the prisons and like working for the prisons, yet let me go. And then along the way, all the 6 countries that I had to run through, if it wasn't every and each of the strangers, and I don't think I'll be sitting here today talking to you. And this was against like, especially I wanted to highlight it out, like oftentimes we as an individual, we're trying to shrug our shoulders up like, oh, I'm a single person. What am I gonna change the world? Like, and then oftentimes they don't realize like they're the catalyst of like contributing drop by drop to this, like until the wave break. Oftentimes you will even be like, the last drop, like if it wasn't that stranger, that wave will never break. And I think people are oftentimes unaware that the strangers could actually help change systems.
That's what you and total strangers.
I think they're the best, the kindest. I think they're not aware of it. They provided life. They instilled hope, and on a larger scale, that's what changed. That's actually what makes a real societal change. That's pretty much what I have to say.
Yeah. So I'm going to tell you a story of the kindness of a total stranger. I was sent by PEN Canada. I was a member of PEN Canada when I arrived here.
We should explain what PEN Canada is.
PEN Canada is a non-profit organization helping writers from around the world when they come to Canada, help them to get the opportunity to write again here, either in English or any other language they speak.
And it works to get writers imprisoned around the world to get them out.
Absolutely.
Sure,
so they offered me a job opportunity as a writer in residence in George Brown College. It's a very prestigious opportunity. So I went to George Brown, but in 2006, and I'm 3 years in Canada, my English is very, very bad. So the head of the college was a very kind woman, and she never knew me. And she came to my office. They gave me an office and said, do you mind if I send you someone to help you with difficulties that you have in English? I said, this is such a great help. I had in my office teachers, college teachers coming into my office and teaching me English while I was getting paid as someone who works for this college. I mean, I was going to classes. I was talking about my experience of freedom of expression and human rights and stuff like that. But one of the things that this great college has done is that they taught me while I was getting employed with it.
Wow. Next question. How long did it take you to feel comfortable in Canada to shed the fear you felt when you first arrived? How long did it take you? Javed?
About 2 years.
2 years?
Yeah.
That long?
Yeah, it took me, actually, I started the refugee claiming process when I arrived in Canada. So it took me about 2 years. And I had quite a few bad examples, like bad friends who were chased down and then like all the way by the Australian government. where people who fled before me, who escaped before me, but were chased down all the way from different countries and put back in the prison. And then, so I was quite aware of that there. And then I was trying to fly under the radar so that I wasn't sent back to the prison.
Now, how long did it take you, or have you gotten rid of the fear?
Yeah, I got rid of my fear immediately, I think. Because like the situation I used to live back in Syria, it was you're in an apartment or in a house and there are explosions happening, warplanes attacks. So the moments that I arrived in here, all of these things just simply disappeared. And I knew there is no war anymore. The only thing that I think took me a while to get used to was the police thing. There are still those memories coming back, but nothing that is majorly serious. So I feel pretty secure and safe here.
So for me to feel belonging to this country, it didn't take me more than a couple of days.
Really?
Yes. But to be able to express that took me a couple of years to be able to learn the language and say, I feel that I belong to this country.
This is a final question from our friends online. As you sit here today, what is your perception of the risks that you took to get here? And would you take those risks again? Would you do it again? Jump in.
I don't think I'll be able to do it. If you ask me to do whatever that I have like written everything, that I don't think I wouldn't advise anybody else to take the same risks. And I don't think simply I'll be able to repeat it. And quite frankly, I don't know what I was thinking at the time, like when I was doing it, but I don't think I'll be able to. Okay.
Here?
I was seeing myself as a freedom fighter back home in Afghanistan. And my life was seriously in danger.
Yeah.
I had a death sentence. What if ever again I get a death sentence, I will flee as much far as I fled previously. I
would definitely redo it again. And it's worth every risk I took, definitely.
Thank you. All right, now let's our audience here in the schoolhouse. Any questions? Right here in the front.
How was that final flight? You left off, you jumped off the cliff. You're on that final plane to Canada. Was it just an emotional roller coaster? Your mind racing the whole flight? I know you felt like exhausted. How was that final 4 hours, 5 hours sitting?
Go ahead.
Okay. To me, it was confusing. Pretty much I was concerned of what would the life look like here in Canada. But aside from that, it was really, I would say, relieving. I felt really, really relieved that I'm making it to a place where I can actually belong, be a citizen, and have all the rights that I fought for. So pretty much comforting for me. Yeah.
The same. I was feeling a kind of flight to relief, a secure place that I was not going to be chased anymore, to be killed anymore. I had no clue of what sort of life I was going to have in Canada and what is Canada. I had no picture. It was a darkness in front of me, but I knew I was very certain that in this darkness I was going to be safe. Jalen?
Oh, for me, it was quite different actually, because I was preparing myself mentally to go through the detention. But the same thing happened when I first arrived in Australia, where I was like, oh, finally a place I won't have to run anymore and stop running and start living. But that kind of...
Yes, question here, gentleman in the red cap.
Not exactly, but I just wanted to say, great on all of you sharing the story. Really inspiring, sometimes funny, and uplifting. I want to say that I feel the Canada is better having you today.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Second row.
Thank you for sharing your story. I will never complain about the very experience coming from both of you. The question I had was, you described your most important things. Do you think that you will ever leave behind the global definition? Maybe you already have, is that something that you think is time that you know
if you see refugee as a taking refuge, you can never leave that behind. In my understanding, we are always attempting to take refuge in a status that we're gaining, but the past is always behind us, and we carry the past with us, and we gain new experiences and new social status and cultural status, and this new status will also be with us. So as I mentioned, when I speak with the Afghan community in here in Toronto, the language that we speak here is not part of the live movement of culture in Afghanistan. We are in Canada, and so we are isolated from the motherland, from the mother tongue, from the mother culture. We are getting this isolation a factor of life, but again, this isolated identity will also be with us, no matter how far we go.
Anyone else? Yes, sir.
I also want to say, I'm listening in stories of souls and family. You were all quite complimentary regarding how the system handled the situation for the game. Governments did a lot of criticism. My question is, what do you think governments could do better? What do we as Canadians do better for other people coming?
I think people with lived experience or people who have been through the journey, taking them or listening to them in the policy designing a stage will be a good start to go with, because oftentimes it is those tedious bureaucratic process that were designed to fail from the beginning, because those were designed by someone. For example, if I say I risk almost like jail time to get a passport, that I will never be able to relate that to a Canadian, because getting a passport was just walking up to the Victoria Street over there. So like oftentimes the tedious, like it's always in the fine print. Like design where it started to fail from the beginning. And then oftentimes I think a big thing that with the Canadian government is like, oh, we have inclusive whatnot, but it's often at the end of the stage, and that's not how it works. If you want to like make the system work, take those decisions, those live experience and those learned lessons when you design the policy, not when you implement the policy. I think that will be a good start.
Can I add one thing? I think it's one of the things that Canadian can do is to try not to see the other as the other. To see the other as someone like us.
Just like us.
Yeah, this is very helpful. If someone talks to you in a broken English with a big accent, if you react in an obvious way, he or she will be ashamed of speaking, more frequently in public, in front of Canadians. But if you accept these differences, which in most cases we do, Canadian does, it helps us to create a life here.
Thank you for being here. Anyone? No. Thank you for joining us tonight. I think it's very important. I thank our guests for being so articulate and open and candid about your lives. The third event in our series of Arrival is on Tuesday, November 1st, next Tuesday, talking about economic difficulties and employment difficulties of people who come. I want to remind you that Javet's book, Escape from Manus Prison, is on sale out here in the salon. And as I said, I haven't finished it, but it's a hell of a read, especially someone like me who know nothing about the situation. I thank you for writing the book, and I thank you for being here tonight. And if you'll indulge me, I really want to do this. Thank you.